Okay, welcome to Diet for Depression. We're going to talk about the gut-brain connection, really dive deep into mental health. I thought maybe a better title for this would have been functional medicine for depression, because we're going to get into some pretty technical stuff here today. I am a functional medicine practitioner with the IFM. I am a mental health scientist. I'm just going to dive right in. I'm also the founder of the Wise Mind Nutrition app. I'm a dietitian. Group practice is called Nutrition in Recovery. Some of my affiliations are the Nova Institute, which is a heart-centered think tank globally of people, places, and looks at all the different factors that influence health. The Center for Nutritional Psychology, I am a contributor, and I really want to plug in the non-UPF program, which is a new certification emerging to help people understand what foods are ultra-processed and what foods aren't. I've talked a lot about nutrition frameworks, and one of my favorite lines is that all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. I've made a webinar recently challenging the calorie model. That was my last webinar, and it's not to say that, the calorie model is wrong, it's just incomplete. There are other models. When I was in school, I learned a lot about the macronutrient model. I remember if it fits in your macros, and then the micronutrient model gave birth to this interest in supplements, vitamins, and minerals, and based on an assumption that a lot of the food is missing essential nutrients and we need dietary supplements. And then, of course, we have food group models, and I like food group models quite a bit. I don't love my plate, the government model, but I like the concept of using food groups to think about nutrition as a way of getting a lot of dietary diversity. Anti-inflammatory models are based on the dietary inflammatory index. The gut health model is an extension of the anti-inflammatory model, but it adds a bit more nuance, which we're going to get into today. Personalized nutrition or personalized medicine, functional medicine, etc. And then, of course, here we have nutrition for mental health. It brings it all together. And the goal is better brain health, better mind health. Calories in, calories out comes with a bunch of assumptions. Please check out my last webinar to get more. But it basically just assumes that people metabolize calories similarly, and that it's just about energy in and energy out, right? It really ignores the role of digestion, absorption, microbial metabolism, and especially how we harvest energy from food. So really good information there to challenge the quote unquote calorie myth. And then what we're talking about today, mental health, really challenges calories in, calories out, because in reality, the brain is a powerful regulator of energy intake and expenditure. We're going to talk about neurobiology, hormones, emotional factors, introducing the world of metabolic and nutritional psychiatry. We also know that psych meds alter biology in some really important ways, whether it be antidepressants or antipsychotics, mood stabilizers. There's just a lot of effects on appetite and gut dysbiosis. And these changes are biological, not just behavioral, and they can occur independently of calorie intake. So if medications change energy or appetite through some of the mechanisms we're going to talk about today, it's not just willpower. There's so much more to it. I was super impressed by the research that came out of Ireland. About 10 years ago, it started. It really examined the role of gut microbes in breaking down food and breaking down drugs. This particular review article I thought was fantastic. Reviews the evidence that microbes can metabolize drugs and vice versa. Drugs can modify the gut microbiome. So the key point from all of this is that it's not just what we put into our body, but it's the terrain in which we put it to. It's the actual environment that matters quite a bit. So when we talk about nutrition for mental health, I've identified three major areas. The first is nutrients that support brain health. Could be direct, like omega-3 fatty acids or B complex vitamins, magnesiums, things that directly impact the brain. And then, of course, we have a lot of other nutrients that are more indirect. When I first started studying nutrition for mental health, health, I did see that pretty much every vitamin and mineral, when deficient, is associated with some adverse mental health condition. It's pretty obvious that all nutrients are important for mental health. Some are going to be more important than others. I read a bunch of books early on, and most of the books concluded eat real food and take a really good multivitamin. And I wasn't satisfied. I was like, there's got to be more. So introducing the second brain, the bidirectional gut-brain axis. We're going to talk about some of these mechanisms today. But of course, there's also this growing field of nutritional psychology, how we think about food, how we think about our bodies, the role of stress, trauma, and adversity. What about body image? We need to go beyond reductionistic models of just thinking about nutrients. We have to think about systems biology, and we have to think about social context. Nutritional psychology is a multidisciplinary field that intersects psychological, behavioral, gastrointestinal, neurological, and nutritional sciences. It goes beyond just the person and puts everything into the larger context. Thinking about things like weight stigma in society, the role of diet culture, all the things that impact our cognitive processes around food. So most people are aware of quantitative nutrition. This is almost the norm nowadays. Calories, macros, fitness trackers, using numbers to calculate percentages, etc. And myself and many others have worked really hard to introduce the concept of qualitative nutrition, where you become interested in other outcomes, like using nutrition to impact mood, energy, vibrational frequencies, quality of life, sleep, etc. And it's a tough sell because these things aren't always easily measurable. But I think if you're here, you got a sense that nutrition isn't just shallow numbers and that we need to go beyond MyFitnessPal. And a lot of the clinical work I've done in recent years has been mental health focused, eating disorder focused. So a lot of my work is influenced by eating disorder paradigms. So always making sure that nutrition messaging is safe, non-triggering, avoiding words like diet and constant weight talk, discouraging counting, encouraging grocery shopping, cooking, connecting to food, mindful eating, soulful eating, consistency, variety, thinking about what to include rather than just what to avoid, and encouraging sanity over vanity, a positive body image. The principles of eating disorder recovery really are a steady stream of nutrients, balanced meals, restoring nutritional deficiencies, having a quote unquote healthy relationship with food. So I just want to put these obvious things out there. This goal colors my point of view because there are a lot of other more aggressive types of interventions, and we'll talk about them today. Things like ketogenic diets and fasting that do have very potential positive impacts on mental health. But my general orientation is steady flow of nutrients, big picture thinking, seeing the forest rather than the trees, and the quote unquote long-term relationship with food. So let's talk about ultra-processed foods. I've been doing work in this area and seeing it explode worldwide. The concept of ultra-processed food was developed in Brazil in 2009, identified 4 different categories. The first is unprocessed or minimally processed. The second is culinary ingredients that are added to foods, oil, sugar, salts, flavors, etc. And then category 3 processed foods combine Nova 1 and Nova 2 foods. So if you think about the corn on the cob being category 1, all the solutions, salts that were added to it in the processing to make canned corn being category 3, and then ultra processed foods are foods that contain little, if any, intact Nova 1 foods. You can't identify what the food is typically in that processing. So our example here is Doritos or corn chips, right? And these are foods that are made by a series of industrial practices that people generally can't do at home. Usually when people talk about Nova 4 ultra processed foods, you think about what we see on the top, a colorful, exciting, textured ice cream product that people tend to binge on. And you could see that there are some pretty obvious flags in this food. But the bottom example is something I really want to highlight, that when we talk about ultra processed foods, we're also talking about diet foods, right? This is a low calorie, protein protein bar. Most of the nutrients were in the form of supplements, etc. When we talk about food processing affecting mental health, it's not just cookies, cakes, and donuts. We're also talking about a lot of these foods that are marketed for low calorie diet foods per se that are also not beneficial. We know that the US is leading the world in consumption of ultra processed foods. This is percentage of caloric intake based on national data. And we know that depression is increasing in the US. Obviously, we have the pandemic, which impacted a lot of mental health. We have some estimates that suggest depression doubled during this time and has not since resolved. So in the US, nearly 2/3 of the foods we consume meet NOVA 4 classification. These foods contribute to about 90% of the added refined sugars, and ultra-processed foods are not surprisingly inversely correlated with fiber and protein. So fiber is going to be really important as we unpack some of the mechanisms today because it's the primary fuel for intestinal microbes and has been associated with better mental health in a lot of different studies. According to Brazil research, the micronutrient content of ultra-processed foods is generally less than half of that which is observed in minimally processed foods. And it's not surprising because vitamins and minerals, many of them are very sensitive. They are lost during processing. You see here, most of the vitamins, most of the minerals, some of the B vitamins are added as enrichments. If you've ever seen enriched white flour, these are basically rules that necessitate food manufacturers add certain vitamins back in after they've been lost, explaining why they might be high in some studies. But it's not just vitamins and minerals, and this is where I got really interested in the link between nutrition and mental health. If it were just vitamins and minerals, we could just take a multivitamin, we could just focus on the essential nutrients and we'd be better, right? Turns out there's very sensitive antioxidant polyphenols like flavonoids that are in foods, and these are rapidly degraded during ultra processing. So in some research, the ultra processed food has like very little of these polyphenols left. So when we think about processing of food, it's not just what's added, but also what's lost. There's a lot of important nutrients that are lost in plant foods, colorful plant foods. Just a quick primer, reminder, polyphenols are these stable carbon rings that can donate electrons and hence the term antioxidant. They can scavenge free radicals, and polyphenols have many of these complex, diverse chemical structures. These are found mostly in the plant kingdom. And it turns out that gut bacteria love polyphenols. It's not just fibers from foods that contribute to the growth of beneficial bacteria, but it's also these polyphenols that bacteria thrive on. And when you give gut bacteria both fiber and polyphenols together, there is a synergistic effect, right? Which is why taking a fiber supplement and a polyphenol supplement won't perform as well as the food itself. So having low intakes of fiber and polyphenols in a combination with high intakes of other substances found in ultra-processed foods leads to elevations in inflammatory markers like CRP, interleukins, TNF alpha, and these elevated inflammatory markers in the context of mental health are significant. And one mechanism is what we call leaky gut. This is from The Lancet, which is the top of the top in terms of publication prestige, right? So this concept of gut leakiness or intestinal permeability is no longer fringe. It is well accepted that certain elements of food we eat, colors, artificial sweeteners, emulsifiers, nanoparticles, impact the composition of microbes in our gut. They impact our mucosal lining, and we have a microbial encroachment through the lumen into the bloodstream. For example, LPS causing metabolic endotoxemia. All of this leads to downstream mental and physical health consequences. So when we think about the mechanisms that link ultra-processed food to health, we have displacement. People are eating certain types of foods in lieu of quote unquote real food. We talked about these foods having a poor nutritional profile, but there's also a lot of neoformed compounds in the high heat processes that take place in the factories. For example, jarring. It's a very high heat process. It introduces new compounds into the food. We have inflammatory responses to industrial food additives, a lot of different contaminants from packaging, plastics, for example, bisphenols and phthalates. These aren't things that are easily avoided, but these are things that can help explain why mental health is declining. And some of these things are things that we can start to test for and start to look at what are these contributing mechanisms. Of course, ultra-processed foods have a higher glycemic load, less fiber, more microbial dysbiosis. We're having basically a loss of the beneficial species and an overgrowth of the more opportunistic ones. And then we talked about intestinal permeability, and of course, there is overconsumption. When we look at the data linking ultra-processed foods and mental health, there's quite a few studies linking food quality to anxiety, but the overwhelming weight of the evidence suggests a dose-response risk for depression, but not for anxiety. So in the large prospective studies, higher levels of ultra-processed foods correlate with higher levels of incident depression. And this is after extensive adjustment for factors like physical activity, sleeping, confounders like marital and employment status. These are dose response findings that even can emerge as early as adolescence. And investigators are smart enough to adjust for factors like self-perceived body image and bullying victimization. So these are multifactorial conditions. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's no magic bullets. We're talking about complex biopsychosocial challenges that have maybe some more biological underpinnings in some people than others. But you can't ignore sleep, inflammation, hormonal imbalances, GI dysfunction, nutrition, trauma, adversity, etc. So symptoms of depression, some of these are more quote unquote biological than others, right? You have anhedonia. This is potentially related to the dopamine system, feelings of worthlessness, guilt, learned helplessness, suicidal ideation, fatigue or loss of energy, which can be related to mitochondrial function, which we will talk about, sleep decrease or increase, weight or appetite decrease or increase, a decreased ability to think or to concentrate, and then, of course, psychomotor agitation. This was the big paper that got my attention. It was an umbrella review, actually, where they pulled all the available data from the different systematic reviews and really posed the question, is it true that depression is a serotonin deficiency or a serotonin issue, which has been the sort of mainstream narrative really purported by the pharmaceutical industry as a way of saying all depression presentations are serotonin and we have a solution, we have a medication per se. And the conclusions of these authors were that there's no consistent evidence of being an association between serotonin and depression, no support for the hypothesis that depression is caused by lowered serotonin activity or concentrations, and even some evidence consistent with the possibility that long-term antidepressant use reduces serotonin concentration. So it was a big deal. There was a lot of letters to the editor, and there was some scholarly debate, and a lot of it came from this energy of the entrenched big pharma narrative being challenged, right, by some researchers. And of course, the way that the pharmaceutical industry tends to address challenges is with more of their solutions. This has been around for 10 years or so. It's an add-on to antidepressants. So basically what they're saying is if you're not getting better from an antidepressant, take another pill. Hey, we have another thing for you. This is another antipsychotic, and there are lots and lots of side effects. And of course, I just want to be crystal clear that this talk isn't about challenging the use of antidepressants as much as it is saying that there are a lot of people who are not getting better on these, and these are the people that need to start thinking about nutrition and lifestyle medicine. When we think about the biology, obviously the serotonin hypothesis, which has been predominant, but there's other mechanisms that are potentially leverageable. The HPA axis, responsible for the stress response by way of cortisol. Most people know about cortisol, but importantly, cortisol feeds back to the brain. And so it has the ability, when dysregulated, to send signals back to the brain and change, epigenetic expression, and has a lot of other potential downstream effects. We talked a little bit about inflammation, which we know underlies all pathology, structural and functional brain changes, genes, which we can't really influence, and epigenetics, which we absolutely can. Depression clusters and co-occurs with a lot of different mental health conditions, so it is difficult to know, for example, if trauma underlies the depression, if the interventions are addressing some of the depression biology or perhaps some of the underlying trauma or early life adversity. And the same is true with substance use disorder, ADHD, etc. We know that depression co-occurs with chronic pain, cardiovascular challenges, diabetes, etc. The classic presentations of depression include a major depressive disorder, what some people know as clinical depression. And then we, of course, have depressive symptoms. And anyone who does research knows that if you collect data with a tool, just because someone screens positive on the PHQ-9, it doesn't mean that they have depression. It means that they are exhibiting depressive symptoms. So that's an important distinction. Unipolar depression is the same as MDD, whereas bipolar depression used to be a more commonly used term to describe manic depression, which captures the mood swings. But there's others that have emerged in recent years. Other conceptualizations of depression phenotypes, the neurovegetative depression, characterized by disturbances in basic bodily functions, often regulated by the nervous system and the HPA axis, and it includes alterations or disruptions in sleep, appetite, energy, sex drive, circadian rhythm, psychomotor activity. So these are subtypes that point to more complicated presentation, more potential for biological intervention. And there's been quite a bit of research looks at different depression clusters and how do, for example, inflammatory biomarkers predict different types of depression presentations. In this particular study of 500 plus young adults, they identified that neurovegetative depression was associated with significantly elevated CRP levels. The conclusion is that we need to think about subtyping depression rather than lumping them all together. My particular interest has always been in the link between early life trauma and depression. A lot of my research has been on adverse childhood experiences and how that can become biologically embedded. I've been very interested in the inflammatory phenotype of depression. If you think about early life stress causing immune activation, leading to the release of more cytokines over time, low-grade peripheral inflammation affects the blood-brain barrier at the level of the microglia and the astrocytes, and this can cross the blood-brain barrier and impact the brain. This is known as neuroinflammation in the growing field of psychoneuroimmunology. So there's a lot of potential inflammatory cytokines that are relevant for depression. Some of these can be ascertained through a primary care physician in routine lab works. Some of these can be looked at in specialty labs that look at panels of inflammatory markers. I tend to use the NutrEval test quite a bit with my patients. It doesn't give you the measures of these inflammatory cytokines directly, but through looking at organic acids and being able to see how the picture comes together, you can get a really good path for reducing inflammation. We talked about leaky gut. You've probably heard the term leaky brain. This is a growing area, very much important for neurodegenerative diseases, blood-brain barrier permeability. I recently threw out the term leaky psych, not a medical diagnosis, but a situation where we just become more permeable, more emotionally, neurologically permeable. Everything seems to get in. It could be overwhelm. It could be nutrient deficiencies. It could be sensory overload, poor boundaries. And this is kind of what we're up against in the world today. So we've got this gut-brain axis. It's bidirectional. It involves multiple systems. This is what we call systems biology. And all of them are nutrition related. So there are levers that could be pulled using food and nutraceuticals and other lifestyle interventions at all of these systems. The challenge is finding out which ones are most dysfunctional and need the attention first and foremost. in functional medicine, we do often say start with the gut. According to a recent meta-analysis, for every 10% increase in ultra-processed foods relative to the daily calorie intake, there was an 11% higher risk of depression. So we have 7 randomized control trials that show when people eat more real food, they decrease in their depressive symptoms. So I guess the point here is that if there's one very obvious lever to pull, it is learning how to eat more real food. Of course, when someone has depression and depressive symptoms, life is hard and it's not easy to just start going to the grocery store and cooking. So this is where the psychological and the counseling, consulting, coaching part of it becomes super important. Here's the systematic review from colleagues in Australia that just basically summarized that nutrition is effective for decreasing depressive symptoms. These were studies that were not weight loss studies, by the way. Okay, so very intentional in the work. There's also a lot of correlational studies, cross-sectional studies, so many that you could almost start to build systematic reviews and meta-analysis about, smaller groups of them. And the one that I'm sharing today that really got my attention is the link between dietary diversity and depressive symptoms. Basically, it suggests that there is a inverse association between dietary diversity and depression. So the people that eat less foods, less diversity, are more likely to be depressed and vice versa. So let's think if someone is eating 12 foods and they move up to 24 foods per week, that's a huge step. There's also a lot of other data with other systems. There's this liver function assessment tool that has showed up in some studies identifying links between these scores and depression. I mean, there's a lot of research on depression and its biology to the point where it's embarrassing how it's being ignored in clinical practice. Okay, we know that dietary fiber associates with depressive symptoms. So the more fiber someone eats, of course, fiber is also a proxy for colorful polyphenols and other nutrients, etc. But this group in China looked at how is fiber and depressive symptoms linked. So they did a mediation analysis to show that it was through C-reactive protein, one of those inflammatory markers. The more fiber someone eats, the less inflammatory markers, the less depression. And, these are statistical techniques that help us understand the mechanisms. And so when we think about mechanisms that link diet to depression, we have nutrient deficiencies, which we've talked about, oxidative stress and inflammation. We've covered the blood-brain barrier, the intestinal permeability at the level of the gut and the brain, the HPA axis. There's a lot of conversation about hormones, specifically insulin resistance. You can see there's a meta-analysis at the bottom right there that highlights the role of insulin resistance in depression. Endocrine disruption, we talked about some of those compounds formed during food manufacturing, mitochondrial dysfunction, brain volume, brain integrity, brain-derived neurotrophic factors, serotonin neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about in a few, and then, of course, dopamine overactivation. So we have a lot to think about when we think about ultra-processed foods. It's not just the foods, but how they affect neurotransmission and what else is involved. In this particular paper was a review article, pretty good figures and summaries here, really showed us how different nanoparticles and bisphenols affect neurotransmission. And there's a lot of really good hypotheses for how some of these compounds can affect the integrity and functional connectivity of the brain. This might be my most important slide today because I get a lot of questions about amino acid therapy, and people are very interested in the concept that amino acids are precursors to neurotransmitters, specifically things like serotonin and dopamine. So we know that tryptophan is a precursor for serotonin. However, once again, it's not just what we take, but the terrain in in which we take it. Under certain inflammatory conditions, under certain environments of gut microbiota, tryptophan can actually be diverted along the kynurenine pathway, which can end up becoming quinolinic acid, which we know is neurotoxic. So if you just take an amino acid, it doesn't mean that it's going to go in the intended path that you assume it will. It could, but what really matters is the environment, the terrain. So we often discourage folks from taking tryptophan supplements. 5-HTP might be a better option, but again, thinking more about the terrain. And this brings a lot of these mechanisms together. With the HPA axis, we have the release of cortisol. Cortisol is supposed to be anti-inflammatory, powerful anti-inflammatory, but at some point it can become pro-inflammatory. And this is associated with cytokines. We talked about crossing the blood-brain barrier, this pathway from tryptophan to quinolinic acid, super important. And then, of course, we have mitochondrial, which is also a part of all the different pictures. And so these are things that I've really started to look at when doing more specialty lab work, the pyruvate to lactate ratio. In a NutriVal, which is a common test I do, it doesn't report this ratio, right? These are things that we have to know about and look into to figure out some of the quote unquote root cause of the depression symptomatology. There's a lot of research on the link between thyroid and major depressive disorder, causal mediation analysis linking major depressive disorder with both hypo and hyperthyroidism, Hashimoto's. It's abundantly clear without optimal thyroid function, mood disturbance, cognitive impairment, and other psychiatric symptoms can and will emerge. This is from Canada, a summary of the different evidence that's available related to nutraceutical interventions for different mental health outcomes. And some nutraceuticals have strong evidence, some don't. It doesn't mean that if there isn't evidence that it's not a worthwhile thing to consider, but in healthcare, we tend to prioritize things that have strong evidence. Things like vitamin D, zinc, methylated folates, curcumin is good for most conditions, omega-3s, saffron, multi-strained probiotics, and there's others. Acetyl L-carnitine, which is important for mitochondrial health, SAMe, which is a methyl donor, tyrosine can be helpful, NAC for glutathione support, inositol is emerging as a really exciting supplemental intervention that you're supposed to go a pretty high dose. I've seen people go up to 20 grams a day, but we start really slow and then move up to assess the tolerance. And of course, there's some really good evidence related to creatine, specifically creatine monohydrate, but other forms as well. And then, of course, we have a whole world of different mushrooms that are linked to mental health and depressive symptoms. I think some of the superstars are lion's mane, reishi, cordyceps, chaga, lots of different mechanisms of action. And then, of course, you've probably seen a lot of attention and headlines about psilocybin for mental health and depression, etc. Lots of studies, so much so that it has reached the level of systematic review, meta-analysis. And speaking about quality of evidence, the highest quality of evidence in depression is the Mediterranean diet. I believe that it contains all the elements that we are striving for in terms of polyphenols, fibers, proteins, minimally processed foods. It does contain basically real foods and the right kinds of fats, the anti-inflammatory compounds. It contains the argument that we are making today, but it's also important to recognize that there's a bias toward Mediterranean diets in the research because once something has been established, right, it's easier to get a grant to do another study on it, which is a form of bias in the scientific literature. Recent review papers have looked at how different diets can affect gut bacteria and inflammation and how they might potentially have a role in depressive and depression-related comorbidity. Obviously, we know the Western diet is pro-inflammatory and reduces bacterial diversity. The Mediterranean diet being the gold standard. The MIND diet combines the Mediterranean diet with the DASH diet. And then, of course, we have keto, which, is a very strong lever to pull. People ask me about keto keto a lot, and I do believe that it's a very important and strategic intervention. It's almost like a medication in that you're going to make a profound difference in physiology, more so than just eating more fruits and vegetables. But medications can have side effects, right? So ketogenic diet is a very powerful lever to pull, but there are some unintended consequences which need to be thought about for some folks. And then there is one paper on intermittent fasting, the fasting mimicking diet, and depression, which I did look at as well. So starting to bring things home, my rooftop, right? In a nutshell, I've been screaming this: nutrient deficiencies and the associated biological consequences should always be addressed before new psychiatric diagnoses are made, that nutrition is not alternative medicine, and that corruption in healthcare must be stopped. So in functional medicine, the role of the clinician is a medical detective to systematically assess patients, identify root causes of diseases and disorders, and build a supportive relationship. So if you are someone that has struggled with depression and has not gotten better in conventional medicine, it might be time to do some advanced testing to try to look at these different biological mechanisms related to gut health, inflammation, thyroid health, to do a full workup and to figure out what might be some of the underlying drivers that are not easily resolving through standard treatments. Okay. In many depressive disorders, motivation is super low. We talked about change being hard, but action precedes motivation. And the good news is you don't have to do it alone. There's a lot of potential levers to pull and a lot of social support. And I can meet you right there in the real world, where we do evidence-based medicine, which combines the available evidence with the clinical experience and expertise, and of course, patient preference. It is really prudent to highlight that there are diets for depression that have been studied, but there's also a huge trend in our world of people going away from math-centric diets and using what we call non-diet approaches. As opposed to like doing a specific diet, you can also just keep it simple and just focus on more food quality, getting all the food groups every day, thinking about creating a meal timing schedule, slowing down when you eat, chewing your food more, maybe saying a prayer, getting grateful, thinking about metabolic flexibility, the gut-brain connection, bringing more celebration, more joy, thinking about eating in a way that aligns with your personal values. These are all things that can be done without expensive lab testing. They can certainly be tackled in the Wise Mind Nutrition app, which is an opportunity to take a transformational educational journey, just to learn about basic nutritions like anti-inflammatory eating, how to improve your brain without taxing your mind, but you can also make it very profound. You could do incredible healing work in the app-based program. It's starting to think about the 5 components: when to eat, what to eat, how to think. How much to eat does tend to emerge. And you can see here that the app is loaded with content, whether it be daily videos, assignments, meditations, cooking instructions, recipes, etc. It's all here packaged for someone that's ready to take the deeper dive into nutrition for mental health and to customize your own little program of recovery. Everyone's different, and it's a chance for you to figure out what's most likely true for you. Most people benefit from eating more anti-inflammatory foods, and this is obviously a place to get more insight and more ideas and more inspiration about that. Most people could benefit from eating more fiber. Of course, there are certainly exceptions, but when you're ready to eat for brain health, try Brazil nuts, try walnuts, try pumpkin seeds, kimchi, fermented foods, nutritional yeast, different mushrooms we talked about, kiwis with the skin, seaweeds, cacao, and of course, there's a lot of animal products that are beneficial as well. So when we talk about meal plans in mental health, it's not just how many calories and how many macros are you shooting for. There's a way to build a meal plan based on principles that are individual and, resonate with your own mental health journey. So for example, I'm going to say maybe someone could benefit from eating 3 meals plus a snack every day, making one home prep meal every day, eating on a schedule, right? Between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., getting all of the different food groups twice a day and figuring out where they fit into the daily schedule, identifying which specific foods in the food groups are going to be most helpful, and trying to get multiple food groups at every meal, having fun foods and desserts with other people compared to having them alone. Drinking more water and less artificially sweetened beverages, mindful eating, soulful eating, logging in the Wise Mind Nutrition app, and conducting a nightly review. So you can see here, I built an app that's basically competing with MyFitnessPal in the sense that you're not logging calories, you're just focusing on qualitative nutrition. What were the food groups? How did you feel? What was your fullness score afterwards? And the coolest part about it is, at the end of the day, you reflect on your progress and see, did I get all my food groups? Did I meet my intentions? Did I do what I was planning to do? What could I do better, etc.? And then that can be shared with other people. If you are a clinician or a practitioner that wants to think about using this with your clients, please reply to one of my emails. We'll set up a Zoom. It's a really exciting time for Wise Mind Nutrition and lots of resources thinking about how to eat to optimize mental health. We talked about dietary diversity, fiber, getting the rainbow every day, meeting your sensory needs, having food that's hot, cold, crunchy, creamy, savory, sweet, chewy, etc. And always remembering that food for thought is no substitute for the real thing. Please check out my research and my papers at drdavidwiss.com. The practice is called Nutrition and Recovery, and that's where we do the testing and the counseling, etc. The app is Wise Mind Nutrition. I am on social media, very active, certainly looking to engage with some of y'all.